Siskel and Ebert. What they're looking at is Friday the 13th, the final chapter. And let me just preface that this is going to be a difficult video because I do agree with them partly in terms of the problems with Friday the 13th being a little too simplistic. But as we're going to see, they really don't mount much of an argument. They just slander the series and sort of horror as a whole. And they'll only allow in exceptional cases that horror movies can be good. But if you watch them consistently, Siskel and Ebert just had a very large prejudice against the horror genre and always submitted it to kind of special criticism. And we're going to respond to this particular take on Friday the 13th, but look at more generally their attitudes, but concentrate on Friday the 13th.
In other words, if you like this picture, what you have liked, I believe, is the idea that someone will get a stick put through their body, because that's the essence of this movie. And the surprise is, it's not surprising.
I did probably sound a little soapboxy, but I'll tell you, I'm not saying the kids are going to believe that. I'm saying this is what the message is in the movie. Now, I sat in a theater, and I saw this with some kids, and they were, you watch them coming in. It's an R-rated picture. That means most of the people will be under 17. They're 13, they're 12, they're 14.
Okay, it's gotta be.
They're coming in, they're sitting there for 2 hours. This is supposed to be fun. They're told it's fun. They see it advertised on television. It did a lot of business. Their older brothers and sisters went to see it. And what do they see for 2 hours? Just cynical defeatism.
It's terrible. It's a terrible film. I think a much more interesting point is that the message that it sends out is not that this is the way the world is, but that now you've really got on the subject, which is that watching girls, and it's mostly girls again, getting stuck is entertainment. See, that's the pornography.
It's really sick.
That this is legitimate entertainment too. That you can go to a theater
and the movie
and pay for
doubled its money in its first weekend.
Okay.
Isn't that
Let's begin with a few concessions. I think it's safe to say that the Friday the 13th series never had sort of the power in terms of mythology or resonance that Nightmare on Elm Street or Hellraiser or even the Halloween series. So even in terms of the genre, Friday the 13th is sort of an easy case to pick on, especially the early entries are fairly weak. There's just not a lot going on with the story. But it's really funny because the final chapter is probably one where the producers and writers actually do start to pivot the series and start to give Jason a lot more complexity. And the ending, yes, it is a little deceptive. It's not obviously the final chapter. The series continues, but it does have a bit of a twist at the end, which I'm not going to ruin for newcomers. But let's look at their general argument, which is that this is really sick and disgusting and just made for money, etc., and even promoting nihilism. Well, again, it's very hard to broadly defend the whole series because it's against so many different creators. But I'll just say at the broad level, they're really missing a lot that went on. I'll just cite a few of them. For instance, in Part 6, there's a lot of parodying moments with Jason. And throughout the whole series, I mean, for instance, the director is on record that, there's kind of like a James Bond homage to Jason Lives. And there's playing with the Frankenstein myth as well. So I think they're missing that. There's also this great scene, which I still think is one of the best movie scenes of all time, where Jason comes across people kind of playing with paintball. And one of them shoots him accidentally. And he has like this red paintball mark, and he looks at it and he thinks, whoa, wait, did I get shot? Am I bleeding? And he's just puzzled as to what the hell's going on. So I think they're missing a lot of the comedic elements in Friday the 13th. Now, they would say, of course, this actually adds to their basic indictment that this is a really kind of sick, low-grade entertainment. Well, I always think that's a really tricky area to get on. I mean, there are, of course, definitely horror movies that are so devoted to the gory aspects, it's really hard to defend it as anything other than just a cheap thrill. But however weak, Friday the 13th does have a myth. It may be not particularly grand. The basic story is, of course, Jason died allegedly because camp counselors weren't looking out for him. His mother then takes revenge upon the camp counselors, but she gets killed off, and then Jason comes back essentially from the dead and revenges her and just keeps terrorizing Crystal Lake. But in terms of the specifics, I just don't think this is going to hold up, at least not what they're saying in terms of Friday the 13th. I just don't see any particular thing where Jason went after women in particular. I think if you think about it, actually, he went after quite a few male characters. And in terms of the thrill that the audience gets, it's a little bit all over the place. Yes, sometimes we do, quote, identify with Jason because, again, the people he kills off are pretty unsympathetic, so we don't mind that they're getting destroyed. But it's also a misnomer to say that, Friday the 13th is the Jason series. Jason does not appear in several entries, right? The first one does not really have him at all, except in a cameo. He's also not really in the New Beginning, and then technically he's a zombie in the later entry. So again, it seems like they're just not looking at the final chapter in particular, but they're just not looking at Jason, period. They just don't care. To them, there's just nothing to that myth. The myth is just so ridiculous, or so absurd, or so childish, that they're not even going to bother really criticizing it. So the question is, why? Well, why is this happening? I think if we look back, they did praise Halloween, and praised it quite highly, but their criteria is a little tricky, and it's this. One, a horror movie cannot be depressing. It cannot be too sad. It has to be affirmative of life, which I think is completely subjective. I just don't see how any film needs to measure up to that. But secondly, and this is what they get into, is that the audience should never identify with the monster, which I think is a very, very tricky criteria, because again, in various genres, we are supposed to sometimes identify with, quote-unquote, the villain, because the situation is complex. So I'm not sure that's going to hold up either. But then the third one is, I really think, really truly bizarre, and they really only single out the horror genre. Probably the only other genre they really attack is the action genre, and that it's not being made for any high artistic purpose, it's just being made for money. And that's certainly true with the early entries of the Friday the 13th series, but the later chapters, whatever you think about them, do have some kind of, again, it could not be very strong, but it does have a kind of artistic intent, whether Jason takes Manhattan, Jason goes to hell, even ones I don't really like part 7 and 8 really rip off Carrie from Stephen King. But there is an attempt to, make Jason more complex, to deepen the mythology, even play around with it. I mean, I'm not a big fan of Jason X, but they're making fun of the series. They're really going to town on some of the basic tropes that they helped create and popularize. So it just seems to me they're not really looking at the films, but they're always judging it by this triple criteria, and by that definition, almost all horror would be bad. It would just have to take such a huge pole vault, basically, that only in very exceptional cases is horror ever going to be a good picture to them. But we are going to see they're going to evolve slightly. In the 1990s, they became a little bit more moderate in their stance. But during the 1980s, it just seemed that horror had just reached a point of just either silliness or depravity, that they just weren't going to allow it to be looked at anything else than just this kind of cheap money grab. And I just don't think that aligns well with either the Friday the 13th series or horror as a whole. It did have a lot of problems in the 1980s, but to say that there was no progress, or it's just cheap thrills, is really reducing and simplifying a ton of creators and their ideas. So it's unfortunately a very negative response to Siskel and Ebert. Again, I understand with Friday the 13th, it does not appear very complex, so it's easy to single it out for punishment, but I just don't think even that series is as simplistic as they're making it seem. All right, this has been Partially Examined Kubrick on the Siskel and Ebert prejudice against horror in the 1980s. If you like the content, please hit the like button below, please comment below, please consider sharing the material, please follow on Patreon as well as Twitter. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.